stage our next panel, Preserving Detroit's Existing Housing Stock.
Good morning, everybody. Good morning, good morning. Are y'all feeling excited and charged up after that last session? Filled with positivity and optimism? I don't know how much more positivity and optimism we're going to give you, but our session for today is entitled Preserving Detroit's Existing Housing Stock. The previous panel touched a bit about the cost of how to finance the housing that Detroit desperately needs. Here we're going to focus on existing housing. How do we preserve operating rental properties that Detroit currently has? And how do you prevent losing quality, affordable housing that's currently in the city from foreclosure or from vacancy, et cetera? So I hope that at the end of this session, you really get to understand why it's critical to preserve Detroit's existing housing. We'll talk about who owns Detroit's current housing stock. We'll talk about the practical realities of operating and maintaining Detroit's current housing stock. We'll talk a little bit about policy tools and then solutions that could potentially make owning housing a bit more efficient, make the housing market and ecosystem a bit more sustainable, and how we can all work together to be a bit more successful. So to that end, we have a really amazing panel here offering very diverse perspectives. We've got folks in construction, in real estate education, we have city officials here, and we have obviously real estate developers. So my name is David Alade. I'm the CEO of Century Partners. We're a real estate development firm. This year marks our 11th year doing work in Detroit's neighborhoods. And I also serve as the executive director for an organization called READ, which stands for the Real Estate Association of Developers. To my left here, I have Matt Boyd. He's the owner of Cornerstone Construction and director of acquisitions for Kipling Development, a Detroit-based real estate firm. I've got Chase Cantrell. He's the executive director and founder of Building Community Value and a neighborhood commercial real estate developer. And we've got Sean Tidwell to his left. He's the founder of Tidwell Group. It's a family-owned commercial construction company operating for over 30 years in Detroit. And he's a real estate developer with over 100 units in his real estate portfolio. And last but not least, Kyle Ofori, who's the director of preservation and management from the city of Detroit. So we've got a lot of really great and diverse perspectives that we're looking forward to hearing from. So with that, I'd like Chase to give us some context. So Chase, if you can provide perhaps a little bit of an overview on who are Detroit's property owners you're working with every day, emerging developers, folks who are interested in scaling development or maybe tackling their first property. Tell us a little bit about, both on the multifamily and single-family side, who's the identity of Detroit's real estate owners?
All right, so I wanted to double down on what Edward Lynch said earlier from Detroit Future City, right? I don't know that we emphasized enough the fact that 93% of our landlords only own 1 or 2 units in the city of Detroit, right? So, you know, Brandon Hodges, Cliff Brown are our friends and colleagues, but most of our landlords are not sophisticated developers, right? They're not doing capital stacks that are $10 million, $20 million, right? They are neighborhood level developers who may have inherited a home from grandma, right? They might have an heirs property. They may have been attracted to a property from the land bank, being able to acquire something very cheaply and simply without necessarily understanding how much it will cost to rehab or manage a property, right? So Detroit is pretty unique in terms of what our housing stock is. The vast majority of our housing stock is single-family homes. Only Kansas City is similar to us in terms of major cities in the U.S. We have 65% of our housing units are single-family. So when we're talking about what we are preserving and who our landlords and developers are, we have to think of what I would call the unsupported landlord in the city, right? These are folks who may not know what a capital stack is, who cannot get financing from many of our major CDFIs, right? Many of our CDFIs are not lending to a single-family home or a duplex. It's a very small number who do. Traditional banks don't have a lot of products anymore post-2008 for this level of developer and landlord. So people are turning to things like hard money lenders, which are charging exorbitant interest rates, or they are using and perhaps also losing their own equity. So when David talks about READ and building community value, we are working with neighborhood scale developers and landlords who need to get the support to understand how to formalize their business, right? What does it actually mean to have a housing unit, a rental unit in particular? What does it mean to put this into an entity? What does it mean to approach a financial institution and what a financial institution will require? One of the things that I don't often hear when we talk about income, and I think every panel you're going to hear us iterate the fact that income is a huge problem in providing housing, rental or home ownership in the city. But when we look at 93% of our landlords who only own 1 to 2 units, 65% of whom are likely Detroiters, they are beholden to the same flat income rates. So people who are inheriting properties or are accessing these properties do not have liquidity. Brandon Hodges talked about being asset rich but liquidity poor. It's the same for this group of owners. When something goes wrong, they cannot approach most financial institutions to fix a problem. If they lose the home, what happens to that housing unit? We know that we've demolished over 28,000 units in the city of Detroit. So these same Detroiters that we're talking about on the rental side, we also have to look at their incomes on the landlord side as well. So I'm sure we can circle back to things, but as context setting, that's many of the people who are owning units in the city. On the multifamily side, similarly, these are mostly unsubsidized units. People are providing naturally occurring affordable housing. Same problem, asset rich, liquidity poor, not always able to approach financial institutions for support. So I look at this entire group as mainly unsupported landlords that we're going to talk about what those challenges are and how we support them.
And given some of the sobering appraisal data we've looked at, you could argue that most of our folks are asset poor and liquidity constrained.
That's fair, yes.
Which is it's a tough situation to navigate. So thank you, Chase, for providing the identity of who really owns Detroit's real estate and given that identity what their personal limitations may be toward the maintenance of those properties. Matt, can you tell us a little bit about those components of maintenance? As a real estate owner, developer, you're very intimately familiar with the cost of ownership. As a contractor, the cost to fix things and repair things. Talks about the maintenance costs, the operating costs, the compliance costs, the property management experience of managing rental properties in Detroit, and then also maybe the consequences when perhaps maybe there's not sufficient capacity to provide proper upkeep to these homes.
Yeah, absolutely. So Edward gave us the sobering statistic about incomes being extremely low. I like to set the stage for context there, as well as piggyback off Chase, who brought back up the fact that there's not that many. We have low incomes statistically, and we know that with these single-family owners, 93% of them who are asset poor and liquidity constrained, when they have deferred maintenance and OpEx, that deferred maintenance and these buildings look like, from a developer perspective, when we go during acquisition, we see only one thing happens over time. Deferred maintenance over time increases because construction costs increases. And so if that liquidity gap is never resolved and the deferred maintenance is never addressed, then when the new developers come and we seek to acquire these assets, we just see that gap continuing to rise and what it actually costs to make this a quality, safe, affordable housing. So that is one of the major gaps that we see, construction costs being one of the reasons why deals aren't penciling, and it's because deferred maintenance isn't addressed fast enough. The second is operating expenses. We have seen, I remember, less than a decade ago, I would underwrite acquisitions at $350 approximately per door for insurance. We've seen that triple in some of the same markets. We have, I'm a novice in the low-income housing tax credit space, but on some of the first projects that we've underwritten, I thought it was astounding to see that, even the state of Michigan was very comfortable with assuming 3% rent increase, which might even be aggressive in a lot of the markets, especially in the neighborhoods. However, they also knew that there was over a 5% increase in some factors such as utilities. So there's already this declining, this steady state income, and and expenses increasing at a much rapid rate, which is going to continue to constrain that NOI, decrease values, as we learned about in session 2. Property taxes play a huge factor in that. We're grateful to have resources like the pilot to be able to help resolve some of the issues that we have from tax uncappings. But we have the sweet spot, and the truth about it is a lot of the operating expenses that we see while we're underwriting, they're increasing in direct correlation to inflation. That plumber now who has $5 a gallon for his gas is going to charge you more when he's coming to go and fix your toilet. All of those costs across your operating expense column are increasing at a much faster and much more rapid rate than incomes are. And so therefore we have that operating expenses just continuing to constrain. And lastly, I'll say this, just in general, we talk often about the opportunity to create new housing in addition to preserving existing housing. Well, the simple math for the nuclear 3-bed, 1-bath home could look like between $10 and $100 a square foot to repair. Higher end, we're assuming severe disrepair, as opposed to $250 a square foot approximately for new construction, and higher for multifamily new construction. It's much cheaper to preserve than it is to build new at this state right now.
So let's dimension that out. So I think we said the average median rent in Detroit, Detroit has the lowest median rent. We saw that for a top 50 city. And then if you look at the average median rent is $1,500 for a 3-bedroom home, let's say a bungalow on the east side. You said $350 for insurance off the top.
That was years ago.
Years ago.
Yeah, years ago. I wish.
So $350. So you're down to $1,150. Your property taxes around $200. You're down to $900. You've got some repairs and maintenance, just typical. Maybe that's $200 a month. You're down to $700. You've got utility costs, maybe that you have to bear. Maybe that's another $100. You're down to $500.
Property management.
Your property management fees can be 10%. That's $150. You're down to $400.
Yep. Landscape, snow. When you look at all of the small nuances that go in, we ultimately see, usually between single family and some multi, sometimes it's 65, 70%. Let's say you were expected to generate $1 million in revenue. You could expect between 50 to 65% of that going directly towards operating expenses. So at that 35% margin, now you take your vacancy rate. Even a stabilized asset, lenders will say, hey, potentially 7% of that is vacancy. So that's 35% comes down to 28%. If you hit that 7% target, because when you're rent constrained, and we have, like I said, we're blessed to have the pilot, but the pilot comes with some caveats. So if you can't hit those caveats, now it's harder to get, or it takes longer to get tenants into your property. So that 7% vacancy could look like 10, even though you've underwritten and you got debt according to, your assumption that you're going to be operating at a 7% vacancy.
Thank you for that, Matt. So, Sean, you've owned real estate, I think, for over 30 years. I think you did your first rental house, I think, when you were 7 years old on the west side of Detroit. So you have a good idea of, we talked about the maintenance costs, the operating costs. Tell us a little bit about the revenue. So how do you set rents? And then what do you do when you have all the costs that Matt talked about and you're not getting the rents you need for the property to be viable and economically sustainable?
Yeah, so setting rents, it kind of depends on your project. As David mentioned, I own a bunch of single-family residential throughout the neighborhoods, but I'm also building a new construction development in North Corktown, and those rents are drastically different. In North Corktown, we are going, most of the units are market rate rent, whereas my neighborhood product, most of the units are fair market rate, which is significantly different. It's NOAA, naturally occurring affordable housing. So to put that into perspective, as Matt mentioned, a standard 3-bedroom single family in the neighborhoods, you might get $1,500 per month. Whereas, a new construction development where you have millions of dollars invested into it, the $1,500 a month is not adequate for that unit. So as far as setting rents, it depends on the project. In regards to what do you do when people don't pay rent? Unfortunately, since COVID, there's a lot of Detroiters, a lot of people, probably nationwide, but we intimately know this city, they don't feel they have to pay rent anymore. And I don't quite know how that works out yet, but I wish I could live for free. Unfortunately, we cannot. And it affects all landlords. We're hearing a bunch of numbers. 93%, I think the number was, of landlords in the city are the mom and pops. They own one or two homes. They can't afford to pay your bills for you. And then the few developers, which we met a few here today, that are in a position to build these big, wonderful buildings. They have debt. And it takes rent to cover that debt. And most people just, I don't know why they take that for granted nowadays. Again, I don't understand it, but it happens. And as landlords, here in Detroit, we had to deal with the 36th District Court, who their job is to help enforce people with paying rent. Their job is to make sure that the landlord is providing affordable, safe housing. So it's a challenge both ways, but again, the biggest thing is it does take rent to pay bills. I don't want to pay your bills. I have enough problems with my own, so that's it.
And so, from an operating perspective, what is the process of collecting rent or getting that rent from tenants who either are elected not to pay or run into financial difficulties? How have you seen that play out, or have there been any changes in that process, since COVID, as you mentioned?
Yeah, there's definitely been some changes, but what is the process of getting rent? So for me, I've found that relationships are the best way to get your tenants to pay regularly. I mean, you shouldn't have to, but it is. Most of my tenants know somebody in my organization on a first name basis. So it's more of a, hey, Mr. Brown, your rent is coming up, it's due, whatever. Relationships go a long way in this business. I've learned that when you're too far away from your tenants, it's less personal, and they're less likely to do right because of you as an individual. So having good relationships go a long way. When they don't pay, I mean, there is a process, and you have to follow the process the legal way. So you file a 7-day notice. Once they're behind, you typically have to have your attorney do it, because here in Michigan, if your unit is owned by an LLC or corporation, you have to be represented by an attorney. You can't do it yourself. So there are a number of good eviction attorneys that help resolve the issue. Now, the goal is not to put people out of the house. The goal is, of course, to provide safe housing and collect rent. But unfortunately, when they do not pay, the end result is they likely are removed one way or the next.
How long does an eviction take?
So it's changed. Back in the day, it was something that was typically wrapped up within a 45-day process. You file your 7-day notice. Within 10 days, you have a court date. You go before the magistrate. You guys either work out a payment arrangement, or if they decide that they're not going to pay, the judge would typically give them a couple of weeks, usually 14 days, 10 to 14 days to be out of the property. If they don't leave on their own, then you have to escalate to the writ process, and they would have to be legally removed by a court officer. So it used to be a 45-day process. When we got into COVID, it took a whole lot longer, unfortunately. But now it's probably more like a 60 to 75-day process. The courts have kind of brought them more in line with where it should be. But again, I mean, the biggest goal is to collect rent, is not to evict people.
All right, thanks, Joel. Kyle, so we talked about some of these the expensive costs of maintaining projects, and then you add the challenges on the revenue side. I know a lot of your work's been focused on preserving Detroit's housing assets. You know, what are some of the stances or policy positions that the city is implementing or has implemented or is considering to help make the housing ecosystem a bit more efficient, potentially lower these operating burdens for our local developers?
Sure. So I'm speaking from the Housing and Revitalization Department, which is one of many parts of the city where folks care about affordability, preserving affordability for the residents who are in our existing buildings. One of the biggest things we've done recently to help with lowering the costs is the pilot program, so payment in lieu of taxes. This passed with the city in October of 2024, and what it does is it lowers the tax burden to developers to 4% or lower of their rental income if they agree to provide housing that's affordable to those earning anywhere from 120% of area median income and below. And the lower the affordability, the lower the taxes. So we have had over 6,800 units go through this process of getting the new payment in lieu of taxes since it got started, and we have another 1,100 projects, 1,100 units in the pipeline. So this is making a pretty big difference in the cost that developers will face, allowing them to keep rents lower and to satisfy the needs of more residents in the city. The second thing that comes out of our department on a regular basis is federal funding. So we provide gap funds, the last dollars into a project for those who agree, again, to keep housing affordable. One of the major sources is the Home Investment Partnerships Program, and the target audience for the renters is those who are earning less than 80% of area median income, which would be about $84,000 for a family of four. Now, because these are government dollars, they come with more restrictions. Developers who are applying to this will often also be applying to low-income housing tax credits for the state, and it's important to be aware of what all those restrictions and requirements are. But those are some of the big ways that we support the preservation of affordability, and we're also always open to the additional conversations. It's very helpful to be talking with you all, developers and lenders and consultants and residents in the room, to better understand how we as a city or from my specific department can support affordability in Detroit.
So that pilot program has been a huge development for particularly Detroit's, I think, naturally occurring affordable housing. We saw the stat on the screen. I think it was less than 20,000 units were regulated affordable. The vast majority of Detroit's housing stock is naturally occurring affordable housing or nowhere housing stock, meaning it's just properties that don't have any government incentives, they don't have these grants. It's just regular everyday Detroiters putting money into property, renting it out to friends, family, neighborhood residents. And those are the folks who really have the fewest resources to maintain and operate their property. So being able to reduce that property tax burden from your assessed value, which could be 20% of your net income. You think if you have that $1,500 rent, $200 a month you're paying for those for property taxes alone. Now that with the pilot program can come down to somewhere between 1% and 4% of your rents. So that's $30, for a $1,500, depending on the rent and AMI level, but significantly making the viability of doing naturally occurring affordable housing, which most of our development community is doing in the city of Detroit.
Yeah, so one way I want us to think about this is who is bearing the risk of having a low-income city, right? So when we have conversations about eviction, and I know that there are tenant advocates in the room as well, when we talk about eviction, I think all of us want Detroiters to be able to stay in place. But part of the conversation that we have with the city, amongst ourselves as developers and landlords, is if we are losing revenue because a tenant is not paying or is unable to pay, does the developer hold that risk? Should government in some way hold that risk? Should philanthropy in some way assist us and hold, like who in our ecosystem is holding the risk of loss? And I don't know that we always frame it that way because we just assume the developer holds an asset, so the developer should, if it takes 15 to 30 days longer to evict someone, well, that's 15 or 30 days of non-payment, and that's the developer's business, so the developer should bear that. But again, being in one of the poorest cities in the United States, how are we as a community thinking of who bears that risk to create a stronger ecosystem as a whole? Because if it's just the developers, and we know that this is a capital-strapped ecosystem, we are going to be losing units.
We talked about the margins. The margins are already razor thin. And we talked about the population of developers. These are regular, everyday working class people. So when you have a tenant that decides not to pay, or the culture around payment of rent during COVID changes, or the time to evict a non-paying resident doubles or triples or goes from 45 days to as long as 6 or 7 months, as we've seen anecdotally, who really ultimately bears that cost? And I think many of us will argue that it's the entire market. The folks who really need affordable housing, that house supply gets sucked from the market. So it's the residents of Detroit, right? So, the previous session talks about capital. How do we attract capital? We talked about all the maintenance, the compliance, the court evictions. If we want to attract capital to our market, who bears the responsibility for taking care of our most vulnerable residents who are more likely to come into some type of economic strain or economic hardship? Is it the developer to solely bear the responsibility, or can we think collectively as a unit, as a city, as a group of philanthropists and CDFIs to make the burden, the cost, the process of delivering and maintaining home ownership and maintaining rental ownership a bit more efficient? So I'd like us now, in our remaining time, what are some solutions? We talked about some of the challenges, but what are some of the things that we can do individually, at the city level, the municipal level, the policy level, to make affordable housing more sustainable given all these challenges?
So seeing our Detroit's specific concentration with single-family home, especially with the mom and pop landlord being the primary owner of the mom and pop home, even if there's no uncapping event, you've owned this property for 10, 15 years and you've struggled just to go and collect your $200, $300 after all of your expenses are paid, right? But that's the person we need to help the most. We have our struggles as well as developers, but that's the majority of Detroit. And the majority of those owners are struggling due to their homes being in disrepair, not being able to reinvest in the asset well enough to go and collect that $1,200 to $1,500 a month, right? I think finding a solution to be able to help those, to fill that gap for that homeowner who has to, right now, without a reasonable solution, come up with 15 grand cash to get their lead certifications and to get their certificate of compliance in order to hopefully collect $1,200 a month and recoup that asset in this tight market, in this tight economy, right? That's what we're asking, and we're asking our single-family mom and pop landlords to bear that burden right now, solely by themselves. And if with that being their prerogative, most of them say, I can't do it.
So I think also there could and should be some accountability. One on the tenants, so just like there are some bad actors, as developers and landlords are also bad tenants. And unfortunately here in Detroit, you could be evicted from one house one day, move into another house the next day because it's not even being put on your eviction record right now. So there has to be some kind of accountability to show people that you have to pay your rent. You have to pay for wherever you live. And on the landlord side, I think, we know the administration is big on bringing up the CFCs, incentivizing the landlords to get their CFC and help develop safer housing.
And I would say just from a city perspective, there's so many more people working on the solution than any of us can see. For one, this conference brings a lot of people together, which is fantastic. There are many colleagues that I have in different parts of the Housing and Revitalization Department, folks from the policy team, from different parts of the city, like building safety, engineering and environmental department. I think any solutions that we come up with for the issues that have been brought up here are going to have to be multifaceted and involve a lot of different people's input, but the willingness to gather and to actually discuss the details with folks who are in different industries is going to help us get a lot closer to a solution that will work for the city.
And I know we're at time, but there are many cities that are larger than Detroit that use housing bonds, right? We have a better credit rating now, right? How do we begin to use our credit rating in a way that makes sense to invest in our housing? And again, we're talking about preservation. It is much cheaper than building new infill. So using that capacity to be able to remedy and preserve our housing in neighborhoods.
All right. Well, you got one question?
So I guess, can you hear me? Okay. Question for Kyle, and it relates to the pilot, because, it's a new program, it's for 15 years. My understanding is you can exercise an option at the end of that 15-year period, to effectively extend it to 30 years. Is there an option to extend that early, even like in year 1 or 2 or year 7? And the reason I asked the question is we were talking earlier, the sale market for apartments in Detroit is effectively dead because, the taxes rise, 5 times what you're paying right now. And then right now, since the new pilot program, for financing, everything works just fine because you've got 15 years. But let's look down the road in 7-10 years when a property is going to come up for a refi. There's only, let's call it 5 years left on the pilot, and then the lender knows taxes are just going to be jacked up. It's going to effectively kill the value once again. And I'm just wondering, is there a way to do 30 or 40 or 50 years up front, go ahead and exercise that option? And I know that the city's going to want to look at it as, hey, we want to make sure they're in compliance, but just go ahead and make it long term, and then you have the ability, hey, if they're not compliant, you just take it away, something like that.
Yeah, so I don't know that that's an option at this point. There are other folks who I work with who might have more detail on what it would take to be able to make that extension automatic or to know more of the pros and cons of doing so. But I do hear your point about predictability. Our hope, I think, has been that the first 15 years will at least solve a major problem that we have been seeing for the past few. But I would have to get back to you on if that's possible.
Yeah, and kind of carrying that forward, and you can see this coming, right? Because 5-10 years ago, when you have all these great developers coming in, bringing all this housing to Detroit, fixing it up, they bought these projects. The taxes were effectively zero because they were basically abandoned buildings that they fixed up. The taxes could only go up like 5% a year. And so the taxes and everything worked, and it made it viable, but then they're trapped. There's nothing that can happen, and the exact same thing is going to happen because anytime you have a major balloon or a major capital event that's going to completely adjust the structure, it's just going to kill the market. So I think it's something that really needs to be thought about.
Got it. Thank you.
And that's why we have convenience such as this one. So thank you guys for listening to entertaining these thoughts. I think we've talked about the capital side, we've talked about the costs, the sobering realities of maintaining and owning property, and then we're looking forward to working with many of you in this room. Think about solutions constructively to attack some of the most pressing issues facing our housing ecosystem. So thank you guys very much.